how do I go to that?
The Rails. So.
Or how do I tab between those two windows?
Oh.
Okay,
Just
you go
point
to the corner.
The corner, yeah.
Okay. Okay. I'll just paste that for posting it online. All right, we're back.
Sweet.
Okay, so
Nice.
specific questions, right? You wanted a question on YAML?
Oh yeah, YAML?
YML, yep.
Yeah, what is it? Or like what does it do on our app?
Okay, so the question is like what is YAML, right? So let's go to
I was looking it up to see.
Let's go to the chapter. So what section was that? Like a user's resource, right?
This is representation of forums.
Right. Yeah. So YAML is it's like another little like a language kind of, but it's not like a language where you can do programming. It's more like HTML. So that's why both of them end with the ML. Stands for markup language, yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's basically like a little mini language for saving data. I don't know if you've heard of XML. Have you heard of XML?
Heard of that.
Yeah, so it's another similar thing. There's XML, YAML, and JSON. They're both kind of like formats for storing data, and you're essentially storing the data like in a text file. So in this example, well, let me share the screen. Hold on a second. Screen share. So here's the example from the chapter, right? It's controller, colon, and then static pages, and then action, colon, and then home. The YAML specification is kind of like a hash. You can think of it as a hash. So when you should be able to translate between YAML and a hash. So let me go here. Well, should be C9. So just to stress it, YAML is not part of Rails. YAML is like its own thing, so you can use it separate from Rails. And YAML is just the specification of the little markup language. So it's also not a Ruby thing either. Although there's gems and there's code in Ruby to be able to read YAML, but there's also code to be able to read YAML in other languages like PHP or Java or maybe even JavaScript.
And really quick on that point that you were just making about how YAML is its own language, but that can be part of a Rails app. I mean, so basically, within our app and within lots of apps, I mean, we might have something in YAML. We've got CSS files. We've got obviously have HTML. We might have JavaScript files. Basically, is it fair to say that within a Rails app, you could have all sorts of different languages that you're employing at different points, and that the main things that you'd have to consider are the fact that, well, like, I guess whether it's compatible with Rails, whether you've got a gem, or whether Rails itself can read that language, and then assuming that it can, like you just have to have the right file extension there, so it knows that it's that type of file, and then basically have to have it saved presumably in a place within your Rails app file, sort of that fits with convention and where it would expect to find it. Does that sound right, or am I misunderstanding?
Yeah, that's right. But like a YAML file is typically the extension is YML, like that's the extension. However, you don't have to name it that. You can, because it's just like a normal text file. So you can just read the string, or you can read the context of the file into a string, and then the string itself is YAML. So, for example, you could name your file. You probably wouldn't want to do that, but you could, in theory, name your file like things.exe, and then load the contents of that file into a string, and then ask Ruby to parse that YAML string. Now in Rails has like different little or different configurations that it chose. The creators of Rails chose to store that configuration in YAML files, and so Rails knows where to look for those files, and it knows the name of those files, and the names of those files are just conventions, but it knows the names of those files, and then by that's where Rails is getting some of the information. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so, because it's just my question was not so much about YAML specifically, but just it's like a really basic question that I had sort of been for a long time, when we can incorporate other languages. And I guess one other part of that question is, it seems like there are some times where you can actually have a file that includes things that are essentially written in multiple languages. Like, I mean, I guess an obvious example might be something that has maybe HTML and embedded Ruby. I guess it's not that obvious because I'm not that sure about it. But are there lots of other? Is it common that you would have files where part of it is in one language and part is in another, or is that very unusual or rare?
So I guess it's rare to have two languages that are I guess computing languages, because we have to make the distinction between a computing language that you can write for loops and you can write methods and that kind of stuff, and then another language that's more like a data language that specifies the structure of data.
Okay.
And so it's rare to have an application that uses multiple like computing languages, but that application, most applications are going to probably use some sort of combination where they have a computing language and then they use a data language. But the computing language probably has some mechanism to be able to read the data language,
right?
Or files that are stored in that specific data language.
And then a third category would be the language, like markup languages that are, some people would not even call programming languages at all, right?
Yeah. So like, well, YAML, it would be an example of that, because YAML is not a programming language. YAML
Right.
is, yeah, just a markup language. So that's why it's used to specify data.
Right.
And XML looks very, very similar to HTML, and it's also used to specify data. And actually, HTML is kind of like a subset of XML, and so that's yeah. So in web applications, you're typically going to be using several languages. Like just in this Rails application, we're using YAML. That's one language. We're using CSS. That's like another language that's similar to a data language. And then we're also using HTML, and we're using Ruby and JavaScript. So
Right.
for web applications, you're probably going to be using JavaScript and then some backend language. You're probably also going to be using CSS and HTML. So the bare minimum is probably going to be 4 languages for web applications.
Right.
And depending on the framework, like any configuration that you store on about the application, you might store it in HTML also, or XML. Just to give you a few examples, like there's a framework like in Java that's called Spring. So it's a framework that's similar to Rails. It's to do web applications. And so the backend language is Java. The front-end language, programming language, is JavaScript. And they also have HTML templates. And for the configuration, they store their configuration in XML. So the equivalent of Ruby for that framework, the equivalent of Ruby is Java. They both use JavaScript. Rails and Spring use JavaScript. They both use HTML. But then the equivalent for YAML is XML in that environment.
Right. You guys have any questions about that? No.
So here I'm going to do some command line code. So here I have I open up IRB, and then I'm going to do like require YAML. To that includes the code, the Ruby code that can read YAML. And then you see here that I do YAML.load, and then I just pass it a string, right? And you see that what it evaluates to, it evaluates to a hash, right? That has the value action and as the key, and hello as the value. And you see that string was converted into that hash. So there's if you go to your sample application, and then you look at your files, if you go inside the config directory, you can see that there's a database.yaml file, right? Database.yaml. So this is YAML, right? So this database.yaml file, let me open it up with the text editor. You can see that the text editor knows how to highlight it, right? So you can see that it tells you how to connect to a database. Essentially, this is configuration code about how you should be connecting to the database. It is just a normal YAML file, and Rails in the background loads it for you, and it knows how to do something with it. So I'm going to load that. So IRB, and then require YAML, and then YAML.load. And then I'm going to do file.read. And I'm going to pass it the name of the file, which is database.yml. And you can see that it just evaluated to a hash, right? So it parsed all of that text in the file. It parsed it into a Ruby hash, right? And so now it's a lot easier for Rails to be able to read and to do something with this data, because now it's structured versus it was just like a big string, right? So that's the most famous file that you're going to be editing, probably the most famous YAML file. Then there's also another file, YAML file, secrets.yml. And here's basically a key that's associated to your application. Anytime something is, you can think of it as kind of encrypted. Anytime something's encrypted, they're using this key to encrypt the information. And so you really don't want to share this this key, because if somebody has that key, then they can do certain attacks on your application. So some people actually remove this from Git so that you don't commit it, because if you commit it and then then everybody's going to have that access to that key, you know. Especially if you post it on, for example, on GitHub, where everything's public, then people are going to be able to look at your key, and if later on you deploy your application, then they're going to look at that key and potentially hack you.
Sorry, so you broke up for a second there. How do you avoid that? Like in this case, is if we're pushing our stuff to GitHub, say, or to a public Bitbucket account, it would be vulnerable to it, or it would not, because the production one is not public?
In this specific case, it would not, the production would not be compromised, because you're not storing it there. So you see that it just says
right.
Environment secret key base. So you're not actually storing it. However, the development environment and the test environment are compromised. So if you have, if you care about your test environment, maybe, or you care about your development environment, then this could be bad. But
right.
It also happens that some people actually don't do this, and they put their key there, like something random, and then they commit it to GitHub, and then after that, an attacker could have your key. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Hartle tutorial makes us use Bitbucket versus GitHub, so that it's not in the public.
Right. Okay. Makes sense.
Anything else?
Okay.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I guess I have a few other questions that hopefully are interesting to other people too. One thing before the questions I had, just one observation. Ramiro, I think I was telling you this when we spoke earlier today. One thing that I had noticed as I was especially this last weekend when I was going through and trying to catch up on a lot of this stuff, I noticed that I was very tempted to like, oh man, I'm behind. I just gotta catch up. And so I found myself being very tempted to just like cut and paste bits of code and just get through the application. But then I realized that I wasn't getting that much out of it that way. And I found, just an observation again, I found for me that certainly that the very best way to really learn from this particular tutorial for me has been obviously thinking of really reading it carefully and thinking about making sure I understand everything. But then the thing that makes it like really amazing when I really push myself to do it is actually going through and like when he says something like, okay, now we're gonna create the view for our to allow us to create new users. And actually at that point, actually going through and sitting there before I read anymore, going through and thinking like, okay, do I know now enough that I could do that? And going through and actually at the very least trying to think through the steps that I think I'll need to take. Like, okay, do I need to think about the roots and what about the controller and all this stuff, and thinking about the various steps. And then ideally even like going in and trying to write out portions of it and seeing if I can get it to work before I read what he tells me to do. And then going back and using what he tells us to do as like a check on that to see, oh, did I get, well, maybe I got it to work, but it's still, I left something out, so it's not going to work as well as the way he did it or something like that. So yeah, again, that's just an observation that I had, like that for me, at least, that both helped me to check like my progress, but also really helped it sink in more and make me realize the parts that I didn't understand, and helped me learn the new parts he was explaining better by going through and trying to do it myself before going and reading how he does it, and thinking through each step. So I don't know if that's helpful for other people. Have you guys had any experience with that? Like any thoughts on how you go through? I guess especially Ruben, this is your second time through it. Have you tried that at all?
Yeah, I'm doing that now, definitely. The first time I didn't do that. I just kind of went through it, but I didn't quite understand it. I kind of still kept going forward. As of now, I'm kind of like rereading everything, just to make sure I really do understand it.
Right.
And if I don't, what I do is, what helps me remember is that I type things down.
Right.
To remember, that's what helps me remember. It's just
basically
if I know I can't remember.
Yeah, taking notes on it.
Taking notes on it, basically.
Yeah.
And that's how I do it.
Gotcha.
That's how I've been doing.
Yeah.
It's really helpful.
Cool. Yeah, so the specific questions that there are a couple questions that I think are pretty minor, and then some bigger questions that we also touched on a little bit last class with Jared. Some things where he was very helpful on them, but might not be able to provide as complete an answer as you could, because they're Rails specific in some cases. I think most of my questions are from kind of the first half of chapter 7. One of the kind of specific questions is, so setting it up so that we can create new users, we eventually we define both a new method and a create method. And at first I was a little confused by that. I assume that now, after kind of going through it again, I assume we're doing that basically because the new method simply allows us to create a new instance of a create method is necessary to save that user to the database. Is that right?
So the way that HTTP works is that anytime you're interacting with the server in the other side, you need to do some like a request, right? And then over here, let me show you. These are some of the types of requests. Like, so you can do a get request, or you can do a post request, a get request, or a patch, or a delete. And then this is the URL that you're doing it on. And when we're using the browser online, we really only are doing get requests. We don't really see in the background, we don't really see a post or patch or a delete. I mean, they happen, but they're kind of in the background. So for example, if you go to a website, like if you type in, google.com, and you type enter, what happens is that the browser goes to google.com and does a get request.
Right.
Then downloads all this HTML and then displays it for you.
Right.
And then there's like a little form here that you can type something and you can press enter. And now what they're probably doing is that they're doing a post request to some other URL. So the browser needs to get the form, like, that has the text fields, like it has the username, it has the password, like it needs to get that HTML somehow, right? And so it needs to do a request to the server to get a form, like an HTML form for creating a user. And then once you click on submit, it needs to do another request to the server to actually create the user. So just to create a user, it needs to do 2 requests. One request to get the HTML form, and then another request to submit the data so that the server actually creates the user. And so, what would you call these 2 actions? Because if each action in your controller corresponds to like another request from the browser. And so one of those actions, we call it new. And that's the action that gets called when the browser is requesting the form to fill out. And the create action is the action that gets called when the user is submitting the information to actually create the user. So that's why, if you look at the controller, the new action is just, well, that's not the final one. Yeah, so you can see that the new action just says user.new, and it creates a new user. But this user.new doesn't actually save the user, right? It just creates a new instance of user in memory. And then this is the view for new. So you see that the view for new is just the form, right? And the reason why we needed to do over here user equals, or why we need to do user.new is because we're setting this variable. This is an instance variable, add user. And then in our view, we're saying that we're creating a form for that variable, add user. Now Rails does some stuff so that it can later parse the HTML, or not the HTML, I'm sorry, the request data easier. and that's why we're using these Rails methods. But you can also just put like raw HTML, and it would also work.
Right.
And then the create method is the method that's actually creating the user. So for example, yeah, here's the create method. And so in Rails applications, you also have two other methods. So you would have an edit method, and you would also have an update method. So similarly, where the new method is the action that gets called when we request the form to create a new user. We also need an action that gets called when we request to the form to edit an existing user, right? So which one do you think is the method that requests the form? Is it the edit method or the update method?
Edit, presumably.
Yep, it's edit. And then the update method, do you have any guess as to which one, what it does?
Yeah, so it's analogous to create. So the update though is update a post action, or is it a that other action? I thought it kind of could be one of two, either update or either post or patch.
Yeah, it's patch. The action, the request is patch. Yep.
Okay, I have a vague recollection of being told at some point that like some apps basically, or maybe some languages don't really use patch and maybe just get by with post, like basically reposting instead of patching.
Yeah, and it's not languages, it's frameworks.
Okay.
So it's at the level of a framework.
Right.
And actually in Rails, you can configure it. So if you really wanted to, in Rails, you can configure it so that it always uses post. So it always only uses get or post, and it doesn't use patch or delete. But this is the default configuration. And these really come from your routes.
So that's all. That's how.
Yeah, go ahead. Are you there?
You broke up.
Are we having trouble?
Oh man, it's just getting good.
It's just getting good.
Can you hear us? Let's see if it's them or us by going to another site. It looks like we have internet. So it might be them. Yeah, well. Yeah, it looks like they got dropped. Well, there they are again.
So what? So the patch is just kind of like the same thing as create, in a sense, or no?
In Rails, patch is associated with updating, like a resource, or a resource. But that's just convention in Rails.
But outside of Rails?
Outside of Rails, I mean, you can really pick anything. So you could, in theory, do everything with get. or you could do everything with posts. So it's it's really up to the framework. But
Okay,
welcome back.
thanks. Can you hear us okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, I think it was a Wi-Fi issue on our side, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, we weren't able to hear the last little bit where the last few sentences you said about patch and delete.
Right. So let's go to the routes, because that's where all this stuff is defined. So it's in config and then routes. So you see how in the app we've specified some routes that start with get, right? What this is saying is that when a get request comes in to our server, we're going to direct that get request to this controller and this action inside that controller. But we can similarly do a post. So if we did that, users stuff, right? So this line right here.
Sorry, can you share the screen again?
Can I what? Sorry?
Share the screen.
Oh, share. Oh, yeah. Okay.
We're being watched by the giant eye of Ramiro. The eye of Sauron is upon us.
Okay, you can see that?
Yes, sort of. It's a little fuzzy.
I think it takes some time to clear up.
Yeah, now we can.
Okay, so you see that over here we have get, users, revert. So here in the routes, we're saying that we're specifying a get path. So we're telling Rails, hey, whenever you get a get request with this path, do something with it. And by default, Rails sees this, and by default, it sends it to the user's controller and the revert action inside that controller. You can also do this other syntax where it's a get about, and then you send it to a specific controller with a specific action, right? With the pound divides the controller from the action.
Yep.
But you can also do a post. So for example, you can do post users stuff, and Rails is going to say, oh, there's a post request come in, and this is the path. So I'm going to send it to the user's controller and the action stuff. So in this routes file, you're configuring whether you want a post or a get, and whatever that should go to. So one interesting thing to note is that it's actually this. Let's do revert. Users. Okay, so what I have here is a get and a post, right? And you see that the path for both of them is the same thing, right? But I'm sending it to different actions. So when I do a get, I'm going to send it to users action 1. And then when I do a post, I'm going to send it to users action 2. So, typically you would expect that the URL, the path, tells you what controller and what action should get called, right? That's what we've learned we kind of learned in the past that that's how it was, right? But that's kind of like an oversimplification of what's actually going on, because What you really need is you need the type of request and the path to be able to tell what action it should go to. Without the type of request, then you really don't know which action it should go to. Does that make sense?
I think so. Do all the so then will we always need to have all our get and post and patch and delete actions always defined there in the routes file, or do some of them only get defined within the controller?
Yeah, so the get and the patch only get defined in the routes, because you're telling in the routes is how you're telling the Rails router which request it should accept.
Mm-hmm.
And then the controller has actions. So you could have an action in your controller. So let me go to the user's controller. Or let me go to the static pages controller. And then I could define an action here, def test. Right, so I define that action. But if if my browser does a get request static pages /test, my application, my Rails application, is going to return not found, because I don't have a route for that yet. So my router sees that somebody did a get request with this path, but it doesn't have in the specifications where to send it. So yeah, it would just say, oh, not found, nothing found. But if we did, if we specify get users and then test, or not users, but static pages and then test, then at that point the router knows, okay, that's an allowable combination. I can do a get request type with static pages /test as the URL, and then by default I know which controller and which action to send it to.
Right.
But just by adding an action here in your controller doesn't necessarily mean that action is going to be accessible from a browser, right? You have to add a route in order to be able to access that action.
Right. But if you, I think you just explained this, but if you, for instance, for a create, like for our method is create, so we're doing a post action can be defined just in the user controller, because I mean the view is already there, like the route is established for the get action, so that allows us to do it. Is that right?
Yeah, so basically for users, I think what he has you do is you go to the routes file, and then you do something like this, resource, and then users. So you know before we did get and we also did post, resource is kind of like a higher level thing, and what resource does is that it's going to call several gets and several puts, and it's going to do it by convention. So by convention, this resource users is equivalent to like get users and then that gets called, if we just do users, it's going to do the users controller with the index action. Then it's also going to do another route called users new. That's the path. And then that one is going to send it to users new. So it's going to send it to the users controller and the new action. And then there's going to be one called get users ID. And the colon ID means that it's going to be a variable. So it could be 1, or it could be like a string, or it's going to, well, since it's a URL, it's going to be string. So it could be like 5, the string 5, or it could be some text. But that's going to get sent to the user's controller with the edit action. And then we have some, like a post. So that's users. If we do a post to the URL users, that gets sent to the user's controller with the create action. And then patch users ID gets sent to users update. Then delete users ID gets sent to users delete. Right, so doing that is equivalent to doing all these things.
Right.
But we don't want to type all those 6 things, so we can just do that, the resource users.
One thing that confuses me a little bit is so that the actions like index, new, edit, create, update, delete, those are remind us how those actions, where those actions are defined, or how they relate to the methods. Like we have a create method, but I don't think, but the edit action goes along with our show method, right? Is that correct?
Let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm missing one here. That might be the confusing part. There should be a get users ID goes to users show. And then this one should be edit like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so
So the methods are the same as the actions.
yes,
Okay.
Rails just came up with a funny name of calling of saying what those methods are. So it's methods inside controllers are equivalent to actions.
Okay.
So in Rails, if you have a method inside a controller, that's just an action. That's what the definition of an action is, really.
Okay. Any questions about that? I think just that all is super helpful to me. I think the only then going back to what got us into this whole discussion in the first place, which was kind of a more specific question in the user's controller. So we defined the new method and the create method, which, as you just explained, are also, the new action and the create action. In this, the one thing that's still a little confusing to me is it seems like the new action or the new method that's defined there seems to be doing two things. Basically, it's both within Rails what's functioning to call the get. It corresponds to the get command to show the for that page, the page that allows you to input for that view, I guess, that allows you to input a new user. But it's also instantiating a new instance of user. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's creating an instance of user. That's correct.
Okay. And then what's the relation between the instance of user it creates versus the instance of user created in the create method, which then actually gets saved to the database?
Okay, so the way HTTP works is that every time you make a request, the server kind of has like no memory of what happened before. So when you create a new user in memory in the controller, so let's go to that. Hold on a second. Let me go to that. Right, so here's the action / method inside the controller. And so when you do a GET request for users new, this is the action that's going to get called, right?
Right.
And so this is going to instantiate a new instance of user. And then this is the view that's going to be used to create HTML. And then we're going to send back the HTML to the user, right?
Yep.
As soon as that's done, Rails is going to, well, let me take a step back. When we do the request, the very first thing that Rails does, once it figures out what controller and what action to call in that controller, the next thing that Rails does is that it creates an instance of that controller. And then it calls the method on that instance of that controller. So then this, we have an instance of user that gets instantiated inside that controller. We generate some HTML, and then we send it back to the user. As soon as that's done, Rails destroys this controller, or not the controller itself, but it destroys the instance of that controller that it created. And at that point, also this instance of the user is going to be deleted from memory, right? And because we never actually saved it to the database and it's gone from memory, it's actually not anywhere anymore, right? This was just used kind of like a stub or like a stand-in for an actual user to use in this form right here. Because if we hadn't created an instance of user that new, let's say that we just had nothing there, then add user would be nil, right? Nope. What happened? Let me go back to that. All right, so if we didn't have that line, then add user would be nil, right? And so we would be calling this form for, and then the value would be nil, right? And then what these methods do, like f.label and then f.text field, they call .name to get the value for the user's name. They call it, and then they put it into the HTML. And since this was initially nil, you would get an error because it would be trying to call .name a nil, but nil doesn't have that name, right? So that's why we instantiated this user. We created an instance of user, but it's kind of like a stand-in for an actual user, right? Because then, let's see. Then we can call that name, and since it's a new user, it's just gonna return nil. And then this right here is gonna also return nil when it calls add user.password. It's also gonna return nil. But the reason this is done is because not always these methods are not always going to return nil, because sometimes we could have default parameters, or not default parameters, but default values. So for example, if you had the total for a purchase, maybe the default value is 0. And so that, the default value would actually be a number, right? So it just makes things look a little neater. In some cases, you can even reuse this form for when you're editing the user, because editing the user is probably going to look like very, very similar to all of that. You're gonna be able to edit the name, the email, and potentially the password, right?
Right. Yeah, I think the only thing that though a little unclear to me, and it may be a detail that's not worth discussing, is like how that instance of user that is being called, that these actions are being taken on, and the parameters are being attached to, that's associated with the new method, how, as that all gets deleted, how it's being at the same time associated with the version of the instance of user that is created as part of the create method.
Okay, so once we submit the form with all the information, then let's go to the create method. Let's see. Because that might enlighten what happens. Right, so here we have this, see, we do another user.new.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a completely different instance of user than the one we created when we called the new method. And those two are like completely separate. Does that make sense? I mean, I think this is an important piece of Rails. So it's probably very important that we all understand what's going on. So if you have any questions and you don't understand it fully, like just, ask some questions about it.
Should we think of the, I'm not sure if this is going to matter to anything, but should we think of the first version of user that is, or the first instance of user that's instantiated with the new method as actually, for its brief period of existence, getting those attributes or parameters attached to it that we type in via the form, or not? We think of it as never having any particular name or email or password, and that only comes in with this instance of user that's defined in the create function.
Yeah, it does. The first instance that we create with new, it doesn't have anything that we type, because that is getting called before the browser even has the form.
Right.
So the user would not be able to type anything yet.
Right.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
It's like the platonic ideal of a user.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
I'm sure that was totally unhelpful to everybody. Anyway, that's a lesson. Don't major in philosophy like I did. It will not help you. Okay, yeah. Well, that's very helpful to me, at least.
Yeah, that's a confusing point, I think, for many people that first start with Rails, is that they think that the first user that new is the same as the one in create, but they're actually completely different instances.
So
Okay.
over here, when we do this line right here, when we do the new, it goes to our other, the one where we put in the email, the other method that we have. Is that what it's doing?
The new method?
Mm-hmm.
No, this new right here is that new right here is instantiating an instance of user. So that's a model. So it's a completely different class.
Mm-hmm.
The new that we have over here is in the controller. So let's see. Yeah, it's right here, right? So this is inside the user's controller, and it's an instance method. So that means that when you do users controller.new, you're not going to be calling that method. You first do like controller equals users controller.new, and that creates an instance of that controller, and then you can do controller.new, and then that would call that method. But in addition to having a user's controller, you also have a user's model. So if we go over here, well, where is it? It's right here. So we also have a user's model, and the user's model right is this, right? And that's just user. So that's why we're doing user.new just instantiates a new instance of this class. So that new is completely different than new in the controller. And remember that when you call the new method on a class, that's the method that instantiates a new instance of that class for any class. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can be a little confusing because there's a lot of new and user and then user controller. It can get tricky to keep track of the differences between new in the user's controller versus like new in the model. And then there's also an update in the user's controller, and yeah, there's also an update in the model, and so you have to keep track of those differences. But you have to remember that there's the controller world, that the controller has a whole bunch of methods, and then there's the model world, then the model also has a whole bunch of methods. And although they're named similarly, because most of the time you're going to pair them together, so you're probably going to call the update method of the model inside the update. Well, I'm sorry. You're inside the update method in the controller. You're probably going to call something related to updating the user model. So it's possible that you would call the update method inside the update action, but they don't have to be together. So they're separate, and the methods in the controller, they're just doing the controlling, the methods in the model are probably doing saving to the database or loading from the database or things like that. Yeah, any other questions?
No, I think that, yeah. So we're just about out of time. There's another kind of set of questions that we talked about a little bit with Jared last class that relate specifically to the users. Well, I guess maybe both to the user controller and model. We had some questions about params in Rails, but I don't know that we have. It's probably not worth trying to talk about it right now. Maybe we can come back to that if that seems like something worth talking about again.
Yeah, I think we should talk about it. Yeah, it's used a lot, and it can also cause confusion because there's some magic there that Rails is doing for you. That if we probably talk about what that magic is, it might help you understand what's going on.
Right. Okay. Sounds good. So for next week's classes, I guess seems like we'll probably be trying to finish up chapter 7. I imagine Monday we'll probably still, I mean, as always, if people have questions from chapter 6 or any of the earlier chapters, we can address those as well. But we'll probably be focused on any remaining questions on chapter 7, and possibly moving into some initial questions on chapter 8. I think both chapter 7 and 8 are, I think for most people, I mean, I haven't started chapter 8, but from what I hear, they're both fairly complex and full of good material for questions.
All right, sounds good.
Sounds good. All right, thank you guys.
Yeah, we'll see you later. Bye-bye.
See ya.